Welcome, everyone. U.S. China relations are always a hot topic. I just happened to be in Taiwan when the U.S. military abducted Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. And of course, the headline news in Taiwan was we are worried that it would encourage China to speed up their timeline for recovering Taiwan. China also had just conducted military exercises. I believe that many of us on this webinar do not want to see a military invasion of Taiwan. And the implications for Chinese Americans, well, we'll get to that. First, a word about C-100, which was founded after the last Chinese military crackdown decades ago in China on Tiananmen Square. In that aftermath, C-100 was formed to help promote relations between U.S. and Greater China. C-100 also aims to integrate Chinese Americans into all aspects of American life. And when Chinese Americans are affected, if U.S. China relations turn sour, we need organizations that will support, promote, and fight for equitable social and policy outcomes for Chinese Americans. But first, C-100 had to take the pulse of Chinese Americans, which it has been doing since 1994. U.S. China relations deeply affect how Chinese Americans here are perceived. We all saw what happened during COVID, and COVID was first referred to as Kung flu or China virus, and what that did to Chinese Americans. Perceptions seem to have improved, and that brings us to the 2025 State of Chinese Americans, a survey conducted with the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. And we are launching the first of a four-part webinar series, so you are one of the first to hear about these findings, which you can download after the event. We'll use the Chinese American Survey Initiative as a starting point for a conversation about some of the challenges facing Chinese Americans today. So I'd like to introduce the panel. You can find their bios on the website. Sam Collitt, researcher and data scientist at the Committee of 100. He was the lead researcher for the survey. He'll present the key findings and frame our discussion. And then we will have a discussion including Madeline Shu, who is a professor of history at the University of Maryland at College Park, and Shin, who is assistant professor of history and American culture at the University of Michigan. We would also like to thank the State of Chinese American Survey Initiative Advisory Group. Great guidance and advice on the survey. Gordon Chang, Daphne Kwok, and Jeremy Wu. So I'd like to first also encourage your participation in the live polls throughout the webinar. And please send in your questions throughout. Anytime you think of a question, please put it in the Q&A box. Thank you. So now, Sam, let's start with you. Take it away.
Yes, I am Sam Collitt, and I lead our research initiatives at Committee of 100. So I'm going to start by telling you what the State of Chinese Americans Research Project is all about. And then I'll discuss our most recent survey, the goals, a brief overview of how we conducted it, and the topics of the findings reports that we're planning to release over the next 6 months or so. And after that, I'll lay out the key findings from our first report on U.S. China relations and its impact on Chinese Americans. And then finally, I'll note some key takeaways and then hand it back over to Sheryl to moderate a lovely discussion between our two esteemed historians. So since its inception in 2022, the primary goals of the State of Chinese Americans Research Project have been to advance Committee of 100's missions to achieve equitable social and policy outcomes for the population and to promote constructive relations between the U.S. and China. And our work on this aims to achieve these goals by furthering and promoting our understanding of Chinese Americans. We're the only organization to conduct survey research on Chinese Americans in particular. And as of this most recent survey, the general public's perceptions of issues and policies that affect many Chinese Americans. And this research can't just sit on a shelf and have an impact. So we're making a concerted effort to make this research useful to and put it in the hands of those that can help us achieve these goals. And as I mentioned of our most recent survey, which will be the focus here, we included large samples of non-Chinese Americans with the goals to, one, contextualize our findings for Chinese Americans. So what does it mean when we find that X% of Chinese Americans regularly experience some form of discrimination? Is that more or less than other groups? So we need data from the rest of the public to give meaning to data points like this. And two, to understand what the rest of America thinks about Chinese Americans and issues that affect many Chinese people or people of Chinese descent living in the US, such as US China relations and messaging around it. And similar to our previous surveys, we want to be able to provide insights on a variety of topics that are of interest to the public, to service and advocacy organizations, to news media, and decision makers. So to conduct this research, we collected data from NORC at the University of Chicago's Amplify AAPI and Amerispeak probability-based panels in June of last year, yielding us just over 2,000 adults from across the country. So the findings I'm going to present here are weighted to properly reflect the demographic makeup of the overall general US adult population. And here's a sneak preview of the reports we're releasing over the next 6 months or so. So we're releasing this first report when this event ends today. The second report will explore the perpetual foreigner stereotype, its prevalence, its forms and consequences. The third report will look at the model minority stereotype. And the fourth report looks at partisanship and vote choice among Chinese Americans and Asian Americans more broadly. So before I turn to these key findings, I have a quick question to ask the audience. So please answer in the poll on your screen. So the question is, who says the US government should work more closely with China's government on diplomatic issues and bilateral policy issues? So the choices are only a majority of the Democrats say the US government should work more closely with the Chinese government, implying that the minority of Republicans feel this way. Only the majority of Republicans say this. Majorities of both parties say our government should work more closely with China's, or just minorities of both parties. And you'll find the answer on the next slide. So given the trend since 2018 towards ever tenser relationships between the American and Chinese governments, we asked the public if the US government should work more closely, less closely, or the same with China's government on diplomatic issues and policies that affect both countries. And the figure I'll show below illustrates the overall and partisan percentages that said the US government should work more closely with China's. And we find that a majority of the public, including majorities of Democrats and Republicans, so the answer to the polling question is C, according to our data, want the US to work more closely with China's government, indicating a pretty clear bipartisan support for a better working relationship. And next, in light of the many federal and state efforts to prosecute, restrict, and ban Chinese researchers from doing research with American institutions and data, we asked whether Americans would support or oppose a broad ban on students and researchers from China from entering the US to do research. And so while there's a significant difference here, I'll show between Democrats and Republicans, still only minorities of both parties support such a ban, and less than 1 in 4 overall do. So this reflects pretty minimal support for a policy that would certainly strain relations among other negative outcomes. And before turning to our next set of findings, I'd like to try to situate the two that we just went over. And to do that, I'm going to ask one more question for our audience. So since 2023, have American perceptions of China improved, worsened, or stayed the same? And you'll find out in a moment. So Pew Research Center has been asking Americans for 20 years now what they think about China. And for the last 20 years, the percentage of Americans that have an unfavorable opinion on China has grown, especially since 2018. Additionally, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has been asking Americans how they see China in relation to US interests. And the percent that said China is a critical threat to US interests grew substantially between 2018 and 2023. But you'll notice that both unfavorability and perceptions of China as a critical threat seem to have peaked, at least for now, in 2023, and that impressions have actually started to improve, however slightly. So the answer to the poll is A, improved, at least descriptively. This is all to say that our findings reflect desire for the US government to work more closely with China's and minimal support for policies that certainly strain relations. That all may be part of a broader trend of improving public perceptions of China. So we'll have to see whether this change is a blip or perhaps part of a longer trend towards improved perceptions. But now, alongside Pew and Chicago Council, Committee of 100 is excited to be tracking these important facets of the public's opinions and positions on U.S.-China relations, including how language and messaging on the subject affects Chinese Americans. So we asked the public, what impact, if any, do you think that the rhetoric and language used by President Trump when talking about China and U.S.-China relations has on how people of Chinese descent are treated in the United States? We tried to be as neutral as possible in our language here, offering respondents a clear out to say no impact, and we have included positive impact among our response options. So even with these efforts, a majority of the American public appear to, one, be well aware of President Trump's messaging over the years with regard to China, Chinese people, and Chinese Americans, and two, think that President Trump's language on these matters cause worse treatment of Chinese Americans. So, in other words, the majority of Americans understand and observe a clear through line between how and what the leader of our country says about a foreign country, in this case China, and the negative consequences that has on Americans with heritage from that country, Chinese Americans. So now that we've identified a problem, what is a solution? So we conducted an experiment within our survey to understand how changing language might influence Americans' perceptions of Chinese Americans and people of Chinese descent. So we gave respondents an excerpt from a fictitious news article that discussed intellectual property theft from American businesses and then randomly attributed to the theft to either China or the Chinese government. And we included two questions that followed this brief article. And the first gauged respondents' favorability towards Chinese immigrants, and the second gauged perceptions of Chinese Americans' loyalty to the US versus China. And our hypothesis was that use of China may implicate the Chinese people in the actions taken by their government, while use of Chinese government provides a clearer delineation between the actions taken by a government and its people and people with heritage from that country. So using Chinese government should result in relatively more favorable impressions of Chinese immigrants and perceptions that Chinese Americans are more loyal to the United States. And that's just what we find. So 28% of respondents in the group that read the article attributing IP theft to the Chinese government said they viewed Chinese immigrants very favorably at 28%, which is double the rate of the 14% of respondents that read the article that attributed theft to China. And similarly, 21% of respondents in the Chinese government group responded that people of Chinese descent in the US are much more loyal to the US than to China, compared to only 11% in the China group. So together, these findings indicate that using more precise language when attributing the actions taken by a foreign government can improve the public's perceptions of a population that is often unfairly and unjustly implicated alongside that government. And last, I'll review the key takeaways from these findings. So our first, as you saw, most Americans indicate preference for a better working relationship with China, and this includes both Republicans and Democrats. Second, in line with majority preference for improving relations, most Americans do not support a policy like banning Chinese researchers from entering the US to work with American institutions. And third, a majority of the public observes and understands the negative impact that President Trump's language on China has on how Chinese Americans are treated. And fourth, we observed firsthand in this study the impact that a small change in language can have on perceptions of a population. Precise language that correctly attributes actions to a foreign government rather than to the country at large improves opinions of people with heritage from that country. So those are all of my findings. Thank you, and I will hand it back to Sheryl.
Thank you, Sam. That was fascinating. In fact, actually, I just want to follow up on one on the previous slide before your key takeaways. A question about the favorability ratings. Does that mean that if you had 21% who viewed Chinese Americans or 28% as favorable, that actually um, 72% viewed them as unfavorable? And likewise with the other one?
Yeah, so those two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So we also had response options for neither unfavorable nor favorable. And also, I think in the other one, it was, neither more loyal to the US nor to China. And so I think, if I remember correctly, a lot of respondents, selected those options in lieu of unfavorable or more loyal to to China than to the US.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, you can put it back on the key takeaways now. I'd like to pick up on one of those key takeaways. In fact, when you talk about banning Chinese researchers, I'd like to put that in the greater context of just what's going on in STEM research here in the US, with foreigners, with the funding actually really trimmed and cut. Chinese and Chinese American researchers are prominent in the STEM fields. And so higher ed is really feeling the brunt of that. And Madeline, I'd like to ask you, since you've done a lot of research in higher ed, most Americans seem to support that Chinese students and researchers coming to the US. That's a good thing. Um, Although I was surprised that 34% of Republicans do support a ban on the Chinese students. But why do you think that that's the case, that people want the ban? And can something be done to shift that perspective? So, yes, I'd like to pick up on one of those key takeaways. In fact, when you talk about banning Chinese researchers, I'd like to put that in the greater context of just what's going on in STEM research here in the US, with foreigners, with the funding actually really trimmed and cut. Chinese and Chinese American researchers are prominent in the STEM fields. And so higher ed is really feeling the brunt of that. And Madeline, I'd like to ask you, since you've done a lot of research in higher ed, most Americans seem to support that Chinese students and researchers coming to the US. That's a good thing. Um, Although I was surprised that 34% of Republicans do support a ban on the Chinese students. But why do you think that that's the case, that people want the ban? And can something be done to shift that perspective? How would you address that question in the context of a lot of the research that you've done in this area, Madeline?
So, in terms of scientific research, scientists operate in international circles. The priority is to share ideas, to share approaches, to share findings. And so they are really a transnational community. And for them, the priority is really to just have the best results, to be the most cutting edge. And to do this, they need to work with the people who have the best ideas, kind of the strongest commitments to their research enterprises. And these kinds of values and the sort of the intellectual capacities, the work ethic to do this kind of research is not a matter of race or your national origin. And the United States has been the leading country where people come to study and to do research. This has been true since at least World War II, even earlier to the 1930s and 1920s. Albert Einstein immigrated to the United States in 1922 because the United States was the best place to do scientific research. And as we try to maintain this, as we try to make sure the United States remains the leader in terms of scientific research, we need to make sure that we are attracting just the people who are sort of the leading scientific minds in the world. And these will include Chinese to try to label on the basis of race or national origin who may or may not be spies is a crude instrument. It is not going to actually improve our national security situation, and it does bear sort of working at, but it is not an effective way by targeting Chinese to actually address the realities of that situation. And we are
So
also
Madeline,
doing ourselves great harm.
right. So I agree with you on that front, but there is this backlash, it seems, against so many Chinese students in the US. I think it's larger than it has been. In fact, 34% Republicans, that's quite high. What can be done about that, especially now that we're cutting off a lot of research funding at universities?
Um, I know on campuses, a lot of people are trying to advocate around this issue. We also need people in science and technology sectors out in the business world to also make clear the kind of impact that is happening with regard to their capacities to do business, to conduct research. It is, they also want to be at a cutting edge. And higher education, graduate education in the sciences and technology in the United States has been a pathway for people to enter and work in U.S. Industry sectors, right? And the
Right.
United States has benefited from this tremendously. I do agree that it would be great if we had a higher percentage of domestic population who also are entering science and technology, higher education, graduate education. But one of the sad truths about our country is that we don't invest sufficiently in educating our own population. And we should, in fact, strengthen many aspects of educational access across the board, not discriminate against international students.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Madeline. Ian, you've had some really firsthand experience at the university of seeing how sometimes scholars are sort of singled out. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl, and thank you, C100, for having all of us for this very important conversation. Before I address that, I want to sort of talk, maybe if I could, just a couple of points about the last question for Madeline, because I think there's a question about efficacy, right? What does this get us to put on this national ban? I think setting that aside, right? For many decades, we could also motivate national policy through appeals to the morality or the ethics or the justice. Those arguments seem to potentially hold less water these days, depending on who you talk to. But I think there's still important arguments to make, right? That it is unjust to label an entire group of people as a national security threat. That's still a point that's worth making. I think Madeline's point is also important, which is that the goal of trying to lead the world in terms of our scientific achievements, that we're actually undermining our own objective in that regard, is also important. And so part of, I think, what we need to do is that make a multifaceted case in terms of why this ban may not be a good idea. And it seems like there may be evidence that shows us in a really encouraging way that these kinds of activist efforts and these arguments are working. So earlier in January, for example, a group of Asian American advocacy organizations celebrated the removal of language from the fiscal year 2026 CJS appropriations bill that would have essentially reestablished the China Initiative. So this was a move that the House version of the bill had tried to revive the China Initiative, and through the advocacy of something like over 80 organizations, they were able to get that language removed, right? And this is, again, it's not a sort of one and done deal. These are going to be fights that are ongoing, but we see the positive impact that collective action can make when it comes to making sure that U.S. national policy is both fair and effective.
And Ian,
To go,
Ian, can you just have just a one line on the China initiative? Because this is really a big deal.
Oh, sure. Yes. I imagine that many of the folks who are on this webinar will be familiar with the China Initiative. And in some ways, this is kind of the backdrop for a lot of what we're talking about. But essentially, it was a program, led by the DOJ, that targeted folks that were suspected of having ties to the Chinese government in areas of research and scientific research and economic research, and sort of accuse these folks of economic espionage. And the prosecutions related to the China Initiative led to a rise in violence against Asian Americans around 2019, 2020. It was criticized heavily as being racially biased and also ineffective. In many cases, the cases that were brought against Chinese researchers under the initiative were not pursued or struck down by the courts because of inefficient or insufficient and inaccurate evidence. So there's lots that's been written about the China Initiative, and it was something that I think many of us were happy to see go away, and so I'm happy to share and to know that advocacy groups have managed to for now keep this off of the national policy agenda. But again, it's not something that I take for granted, and very well could come back depending on who's in charge.
Right.
Um,
No, that's great. If you could talk about what you've seen on campuses as well, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah, and I'm sure Madeline could talk about this as well. One of the
Yes.
roles that I play at the University of Michigan is as the associate director of our Center for Chinese Studies, and in that capacity, have gotten to know many wonderful scholars, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows from China. And just as a very sort of minor point, one of the things that's very clear to me as I work with these students who are really promising researchers in a number of fields is that they are sort of reshaping their plans as to what they want to research and also where they want to be as a result of their fear that if, for example, they were to leave this country on a summer research, that they wouldn't be able to get back in because their visas would then be revoked at any given point. And this is going back to Madeline's point, which is that when we're doing research, whether it's in the sciences or even in the humanities and social sciences, that these are endeavors in which we want people to ask questions that lead them wherever they may want to go. Right. And so if we are shutting off avenues of inquiry, if we're closing doors on intellectual curiosity, this ultimately puts us in a position where we are more impoverished intellectually, culturally, spiritually, than if we were to actually let people pursue their research agendas where they want them to go.
No, that's really important, and certainly in general for stem cell or STEM research, the funding being cut off is just very harmful to the entire U.S. country here. Can you talk about that case of with the bioterrorism and the graduate student and what happened there?
Yeah, so Cheryl, what you're referring to, I think, is a case that was brought up in the fall, where a postdoctoral fellow, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Michigan, and her partner were charged by the Eastern District of Michigan by the DOJ with bioterrorism for bringing a fungus that is known to potentially cause agricultural crop blight into the country. This was a case that got a little bit of coverage. I think has not been discussed very much, in part because the researchers pled guilty to, I believe, to the charges. What's unfortunate about this particular case is that this is really where Sam's point about precise language comes in, and where the way that the case was prosecuted in the public really were based on sort of trumped up charges, based on what the researchers were doing, because plant biologists, recognize based on the specimen that was brought in that this is actually a fungus that already exists in the United States ecological system. It's not something that's new, and so to the extent that we're worried about there being biological agents that are brought into the United States, and certainly nobody wants that to happen. And there's a very fair case to be made that there are reasons why people should not be importing live specimens into the United States in an uncontrolled sort of way, but that this charge of bioterrorism was really amplifying these fears that are really unnecessary adversary, not based on scientific fact. Again, this fungus already exists in the United States, and so it's not that it's a new kind of specimen that would harm the agricultural system of the United States, and that there's already some evidence that it does cause some amount of blight around the United States. But it really played on and sort of amplified again this fear of Chinese scientists as undermining national security in a way that doesn't match with the sort of scientific fact. I think this is a situation where we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We have to be able to recognize, yes, there are certain things that we want to be able to do to keep the United States safe. At the same time, we need to be able to do it in a way that is precise and that respects people's civil rights and make sure that we keep Chinese and Chinese Americans safe in the United States. We really can and need to be able to do both things at the same time.
Yeah, and just to clarify a little bit, they didn't plead guilty to bioterrorism, did they? They
Right.
pleaded guilty to bringing in the plants
That's right.
without declaring it.
That's right.
And mind you, as I understand it, it isn't uncommon to do that. There are scientists who tend to bring in things like that, and they probably should declare it, but they don't. Is that correct?
I don't want to throw my science colleagues under the bus. I don't know what their standard practice is, but as a historian, I try not to bring back things that I'm not supposed to bring back. I always feel scared when I walk by the CBP line, so I always, make sure that I declare everything, even if it's candy that I bring back from a foreign trip.
Okay. Oh, you're very good about that. But I do think that the science and technology, because there are so many Chinese Americans and Chinese in that field, they are particularly singled out, on top of the current, perception of Chinese Americans and Chinese people of Chinese descent. You have on top of that this whole campaign by the government right now against science and research funding. And so I do think that perhaps Chinese Americans are disproportionately affected or hurt by this. I don't, Madeline, in your view of history, is this a little bit more unusual?
So I think sadly, and this is also responding to some of the questions that are showing up in the Q&A, the politics of hate are unfortunately very effective. And that when political entities are seeking to galvanize support for themselves, they might be in tight races. One of the strategies that works is to just try to foster hate, foster a sense of anxiety and fear of an outsider population. And Chinese disproportionately have been used as this kind of target. In U.S. history, we can go back to 1852. This is drawing on Ian's advisor, May Nye's just impressive study, The Chinese Question. And she found instances of anti-Chinese hate being used by politicians to cultivate support in California as early as 1852. We saw it in Australia. We saw it in South Africa. We saw it in Britain, places where there were actually tiny populations of Chinese. We were not talking about scientists or technicians at those historical junctures. We are talking about racial animus, right? And I think many of the listeners here will know that Chinese were the targets for the first enforced immigration restrictions in U.S. history. They have been the major group targeted, the first group targeted, identified by race. And so we see how powerfully this works in the history of the United States. Right now, it's being attached to these claims of espionage regarding intellectual property, military threats. I think many of the people here will recall the case of the Taiwanese American scientist Wen Ho Lee in 1999, who was accused of spying for China on the basis of evidence, so-called evidence, such as he had gone to a conference in China and he had hugged a scientist there. He was indicted on something like 59 counts of mishandling information. But what he had actually done is he just downloaded some stuff at the office onto his home computer that he probably shouldn't have done that, but he was going to work on it at home. And many of his colleagues did the same thing, right? Nobody else was indicted, for espionage, although his indictment got changed. But there has been a long history of using Chinese fanning the flames of anti-Chinese hostility by people for political purposes. And in this, it's affecting, as you are talking about, not just scientists and technicians, graduate students, but also many Chinese American people. But it is part of this older and broader set of patterns.
Well, yes, I totally agree that it's waxed and waned, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was horrific. I mean, I think there's the only law written, approved by Congress that excludes a race, except for, and I guess now we have many more exclusions as well. But in terms of Chinese-U.S. relations and how that has an impact on the perception of Chinese Americans, um, more recently, we've had sort of upticks, partly, it was under the China Initiative, um, promoted by Trump's first administration. But now I wonder, do you think that the relations are much more tense because of a personality between, President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump, or is it that we have a Thucydides trap where, a rising power just threatens the ruling power? And
So
thereby has an impact on perceptions of Chinese Americans. Both of you, please.
I think the United States, and if you look at Gordon Chang's book, I think this is the Stanford Gordon Chang, the book Fateful Ties, and he explores the United States' long fascination with China. Even dating back to colonial times, the United States has been fascinated by China's wealth, Chinese culture. If you were a American of high status, you have a set um, of porcelain from China, right? Silks and teas, and part of the impetus of the United States to expand all the way over to the Pacific was to get a more direct trade route to trade directly with China. So the United States has always been fascinated in so many ways with China. And I think a lot of times we forget that before 1800, China was an extremely wealthy, perhaps the wealthiest, considered a elite civilization, and went into decline under duress, under sort of pressures and exploitation by Western imperial powers, right? And we forget this. And so it has made it very difficult, I think, for the United States to understand how do we actually have a relationship within a China that is recovering its sense of purpose, its sense of self-determination, its wealth and influence in the world, right? This is just, a restoration of a historical situation, and we have not figured that out. The United States also lacks with China a mutual security arrangement, right? The United States made sure to do this with many countries after World War II, with Western Europe, with Japan, with many countries in Asia. And with these countries, we work together quite well. We collaborate. We have all become much wealthier, just sort of working together. But this did not happen between the United States and China. But there are so many reasons why it should happen. There are so many reasons. We have so many shared causes. We do not want to be at war. We have historically also collaborated very effectively. So before I go on too long, I will just share this story. So if Chinese were the first targets for immigration restriction, Chinese were also educated Chinese, having Chinese come over for international education, and then that there was a recognition that, we actually really appreciate the opportunity to educate Chinese, to share with them, to share values, to sort of acknowledgement that Chinese are very smart. We just, in fact, they can be our neighbors. They can be, we can sit down to table with them. We can share our research labs with them. This also led to the liberalization of U.S. immigration laws so that we started having these employment preferences. And these get written into law in 1952. They are a major feature of the 1965 Immigration Act. That started with Chinese as well. right? And so this reminds us, this underscores that, at different junctures in history, both Chinese and Americans focused more on what we share, right? That we can collaborate, we can work together, we can share our workplaces, we can share our communities very fruitfully.
So,
Let,
go ahead,
can
Ian.
I just jump in real quick? A
Yes,
couple of
please.
thoughts. And this builds on what Sam was sharing about the kind of maybe glimpse at a slight drop in the unfavorable rating that, since 2023, that the perceptions of China as a critical threat increased from 2014 to 2023 and peaked that year. I'm reminded of the kind of most recent news where, as President Trump was threatening the U.S. takeover of Greenland, that one of the sort of lines that he sort of said is, maybe, Russia and China have been the real boogeyman along, right? They've just been sort of held up by the West as these threats. Maybe it's NATO that's the real threat, right? And I'm fascinated by that because in some ways he's kind of extending a hand or an olive branch, to the PRC and to Xi Jinping. And what's fascinating to me is that I think the uproar over this kind of turn in Trump's tone towards our Western allies in Europe is that they're not used to it, right? Everybody else in the world, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, right? Everybody knows that this is how the United States has been prone to act based on history. If you look at the Mexican-American War, if you look at the most recently the sort of actions against President Maduro in Venezuela, the thing that's upsetting everyone is that the NATO allies are not used to being treated this way, right? And I think this is the thing that is kind of making everybody sit up and take notice.
Well, but it is true that in recent history, we have been friends with them, and you don't really think of, antagonizing your friends, right?
Yes, and that's what they've been used to. But I think that what I'm trying to say is that the long track record is the United States has sort of thrown its weight around in a way that many historians like Madeline and I would agree that as an imperial power dating back even to the 19th century, right, that it has really kind of done whatever it wanted to do under this idea that might is right and manifest destiny, right, makes right. The other thing I wanted to say about sort of the Thucydides trap is that, I think one example, sitting here I am in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that it really behooves me to remind everyone, and some of us may not really need, heavy reminders of this, but that we have really kind of a tragic history in which a power that was perceived as challenging the United States, especially economically in the 1980s, Japan, led to really tragic consequences, right? That in 1982, a 27-year-old Chinese American man was beaten to death in Detroit because he was tied to this general atmosphere that Japan was threatening the economic vitality of the United States, especially with auto manufacturing. And there was a witness at the scene of this
Victor
attack.
Chin, right?
Yeah, at Vincent Chin,
Vincent.
a witness remembered one of the attackers saying something like, "It's because of you," and he used an expletive that I won't repeat. "It's because of you that we're unemployed or we're out of a job." And so this sort of idea that the United States sort of redirects its anger and its frustration and its anxiety about its particular sort of insecurity and precarity for its people of color is something that we see, really tragic examples of from history. And he's certainly not the only one. And it makes even a bigger difference that, Americans, unfortunately, have not had a very good track record of being able to tell Asian people apart, right? And so Vincent was not Japanese; he was Chinese, but it didn't matter. And this has also been the case during COVID in terms of a lot of the anti-Asian attacks that happened, where Thai, Burmese, and people of other Asian backgrounds were also attacked. No one, I should make clear, should be attacked. But what we unfortunately see is the displacement of a lot of this anger and anxiety onto the bodies of Asian people in the United States.
Let me pick up on one of the questions in the Q&A is how can we better educate the American public and policymakers? Is there a historical, precedent for this? Or, even if there isn't, what can we do?
So there are resources out there. So for example, UCLA's Asian American Studies Center is spearheading this major curriculum project called Foundations and Futures on many topics in Asian American studies designed for K through 12 classrooms. There are different, we have more and more Asian American studies scholars who are training in education, and they are trying to develop curriculum. So this is to try to get the legislation passed at your local levels, at the level of your states, to ensure that more people, when they're learning U.S. history, that they are also learning how Asian Americans are core elements, just are interwoven into that tapestry. That's one of the measures you can undertake. I mean, there are other ways in which this is more on the level of person-to-person relations. And so I think one of the Q&A questions points out that one of the advantages of having Chinese come over is that they sort of gain exposure to American society and culture. And this was actually also a key element of the commitment to higher education, international programs. The foundations of higher education international programs in the United States actually had a lot to do with educating Chinese, also with educating Filipinos. And there was a recognition that this was a way that the United States could seek to build relationships, exert influence, right? And the idea actually really was based on this idea of uplift and civilizing lesser peoples. But there was this understanding that education was a way in which we could have these relationships, right? In which people could learn about the United States, and the presumption was that you would then just take back what you learned and apply it to your home countries. Right? Yes, but in this process, many Chinese come over, many Asians come over, and they are sort of multicultural, multiliterate. They are speaking to a lot of different populations, right? And also serve to mitigate racialized perceptions, right? Because once you're sort of speaking on equal terms, you're interacting as equals, as, I think it takes a lot to be considered fully a cultural and intellectual equal, but certainly speaking on much more egalitarian terms, right? That people are forced to acknowledge and deal with your humanity, right? And I think this is something that we actually can all practice, all of us who are, Chinese or not Chinese, Asian or not Asian, is just to sort of deal with other people and to recognize our shared qualities as human beings. We share more values than we don't, right? And so it is, that's something that that everybody could do.
Right. No, I appreciate that. Ian, do you have something to add?
No, I'll note that I think I'm the beneficiary and descendant of, one of these Chinese overseas students who came, from Hong Kong to study at UC Berkeley. My uncle Ronald, who was a professor of naval architecture, ended up teaching at UC Berkeley for many decades, came over as an undergraduate student and then ended up getting his PhD in the United States. And the rest of my family followed in that, chain migration that that certain members of the political class love to, criticize. And here I am, speaking to all of you as a professor at the University of Michigan teaching U.S. history, that people make immense contributions to American society, to American culture. But it's also incumbent on the United States to welcome people, because we know, and Madeline's research, I think, has shown more than anybody else's, what happens when people are told that they don't belong, right? And they're not welcome, and that their contributions are not valued. And they go and they take their expertise somewhere, because it is really an international marketplace, right? And so go back to Madeline's point, there's a price to pay for these kinds of policies and actions.
Yeah. I want to pick up on another question that's also pertinent to this discussion is, as we educate, the American public and policymakers on, how we actually, Chinese Americans can contribute, there, of course, is the national security threat. There are Chinese spies. They have infiltrated definitely in the society. They sometimes plant Chinese students as spies too. So what do we do about that? How do we differentiate? What can be done about that? Because it does poison the mix, so to speak.
Well, you don't pass a blanket ban on all Chinese students, or even all Chinese students who have some sort of affiliation with the military institution, right? Because that actually is not going to help you identify who the real problems are, right? The FBI, the CIA, you need to actually, I think, probably find your own agents who can figure out how to identify the networks, how this sort of this kind of intelligence gathering is happening, this kind of blunt force. So for example, I'll go back to the case of One Ho Lee. One Ho Lee became a sacrificial victim, right? The Clinton administration had been accused of being soft on China. They decided, okay, we need to show that we actually are serious about this. So we will take the sacrificial victim, One Ho Lee, even though, he in fact was such a, if you just thought about it, this Taiwanese American, and he was like Taiwanese, not just
I
sort of a
know.
mainland. Yeah,
They wanted a
that
scapegoat, it
yeah,
seems.
and if they're serious about this, I think they could deploy kind of expert networks, develop the expert networks, rather than doing these grand sort of
Sweet. Yeah.
sweeping measures, which, it's the Dr. Jane Wu at Northwestern University just is summarily accused of some sort of wrongdoing very abruptly. Her lab is shut down. She's stripped of her position, and she committed suicide.
Yes, that's terrible. That really is awful. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
But it is an example about how people's lives have been ruined, right? And I have listened to testimony offered up by different scientists, and they talk about how, like, maybe they like misdescribed how a grant happened, right? So many people have sort of been indicted or called out because there's just sort of slight errors in reporting in their grants, right? And then the FBI show up in the early morning hours and they wake up your family, there's a big commotion, all your neighbors are watching, and then you are walked out in handcuffs, right? There is the shame and the humiliation. Disproportionately, the indictments have been against Chinese American scientists, and most of them have been dismissed. They have not held up water. We also have, like, I think the poster child of this is Dr. Gang Chen, who is at MIT, who just has, I think, something like over 100 patents. Just incredibly productive researcher who has now said he was accused of wrongdoing and has now categorically stated he is just going to stop doing research at all,
I think it
right?
was
Because
two
the
years
risks,
in legal
yeah,
troubles. 2 years.
yes, the risks for him are just too high, and that is silencing somebody who is he's going to stay in the United States, he's going to continue teaching, but he is not going to do research anymore. And just you think about what he would have discovered, just what he would have developed, but now he has stopped, and this is sort of the chilling effect, right? And um yeah,
Well, but it's also actually stymieing research collaborations between China and American universities. I don't think anybody wants to do official collaborations now. They're too scared that that will mean they'll be investigated. I don't know if that's what you're seeing, Ian, too.
Well, I was going to say, I think the case of Jane Wu that Madeline mentioned is a really tragic one, and I think it speaks to the fact that there are a lot of people who are responsible for that particular tragedy, and one of them is Northwestern University. I mean, I don't pretend to be a lawyer, and so I can't assess the specifics of the case, but I think one of the things that we need to do is to hold the institutions that we're a part of accountable, right? And most of that is we're talking about kind of research universities, because that's largely where a lot of these kind of cases are playing out, and making sure that universities are not punishing researchers and depriving them of a livelihood before they are proven guilty, is one of the sort of basics of, it feels like, American jurisprudence that's sort of been thrown out the window. To your question, Cheryl, about what we can do, I think one of the things I want to emphasize is Madeline's point. about the loss of regional and cultural expertise in the federal government with the reorganizations that happened in 2025, right? Hundreds of agents, but also officers within the State Department and USAID were let go who are Mandarin speakers, right? Who would have the kind of knowledge and expertise to be able to carefully go through these cases and assess the actual impact on national security. And so we need to invest in those kinds of people, and we need to press the federal government to be able to do a better job of that. But the last point I want to make, and in some ways this is kind of a slight sort of suggestion to even the survey, is I think we also need to develop a more complicated and a more complex view of quote unquote national allegiance. It's very possible for someone to feel both an allegiance to the United States and an attachment to China or to Taiwan, and for those things to coexist, and for that not to be a bad thing, right? We often talk of it as kind of a choice that you need to be one or the other. But as I think many of us probably on this webinar feel, whether for political reasons or cultural reasons or family reasons, that we have attachments to lots of different places in the world. And I don't think Asian or Chinese Americans are the people who are singular, or distinctive in that regard. And so I think promoting that sort of celebrating that sense of it's okay to be cosmopolitan, to identify with lots of places, to have attachments to lots of different places in the world, to think of that as a positive thing is one really important thing that we could do in order to sort of push back on these kinds of cases and this kind of discrimination.
Well, we will see a lot of that celebration over the Chinese New Year, so I think that will pretty self-evident. But I think you're absolutely right that just like other major countries, other nationalities, they celebrate both their heritage and also their American citizenship. I think that we certainly as Chinese Americans should be very proud of that and not try and hide one or the other, which I think sometimes we're forced to do. So anyway, I think that now we are getting close to the very end, and I do want to thank both of you and Sam for a wonderful discussion, and thank you all for you who were sending in your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I think we're going to try and collect the questions and maybe address them in future seminars. So please stay tuned and join the other seminars. And now I'm turning it over to Cindy.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sheryl. Thank you, Ian, Madeline, and Sam for just really such a lively discussion. And thank you for all the nearly 300 attendees today with the questions. And as Sheryl mentioned, we're collecting these questions and we'll address them in either a webinar follow-up as well as a written P&L. I do want to let you all know that the full report is now available. This is the first of 4 series. There's a QR code. We're having a little technical difficulty, so you will be prompted to hit the download button twice to get the report. Hopefully we'll have that resolved shortly. And in our questions, and also Ian just alluded to, there's so much opportunity here to really create more information for the American public through our survey work. So if you are able to and interested, please consider contributing, and the donation link is provided in the chat. I do want to preview an exciting program that we have coming up in early February. It's a monthly webinar called the Equity Pulse. And the purpose of this webinar is really to look at these appear to be race neutral and for purposes of national security type policies that end up having unintended consequences and secondary discrimination towards the Chinese American and the AAPI community. We're happy to start off this series on February 3rd with Frank Wu, president of Queens College, and he'll talk about some of the historical policies. I suspect there might be some that were discussed today that he'll address. So please do sign up and register for that webinar. And then really just as a last minute housekeeping We will have a post-event survey after this once you log off. We do encourage you to take a minute to complete this. It's helpful for us and for our feedback. And then lastly, this recording will be available on our website in the upcoming days. Thank you all so much for joining today. We hope to see you on February 3rd at the Equity Pulse webinar, and then our second of this series at the end of March. Thank you so much.